Lieutenant Commander Frank Morrison stared at the sonar screen, watching the green blip that had been stalking his destroyer escort for the past 18 minutes. 300 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea, Commander Hiroshi Tanaka was doing the exact same thing, studying his hydrophone readings, calculating angles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Neither man knew that in 72 hours, one of them would be writing a letter that would change how the Imperial Japanese Navy viewed American destroyer escorts forever. This is the story of the most brutal cat-and-mouse game ever played beneath the Pacific, where hunters became hunted and predators learned to fear their prey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The USS Whitmore cut through the choppy waters of the Philippine Sea like a grey knife, her hull vibrating with the steady rhythm of twin screws pushing her forward at 18 knots. It was March 15, 1944, and Lieutenant Commander Frank Morrison stood on the bridge, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he scanned the horizon through salt-stained binoculars. The destroyer escort had been hunting Japanese submarines for 6 days straight, part of a coordinated sweep designed to clear the shipping lanes between Leyte and Mindanao. Morrison had earned his reputation the hard way. Born in a small farming town outside Omaha, Nebraska, he'd worked his way up from ensign through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to think like his enemy. His crew called him the bloodhound behind his back, not out of disrespect, but because Frank Morrison could smell a submarine in the water from 20 miles away. 300 feet below the surface, Commander Hiroshi Tanaka pressed his eye to the periscope of the I-47, watching the American destroyer escort's distinctive silhouette slice across his field of view. Tanaka was no ordinary submarine commander. He graduated at the top of his class from the Imperial Naval Academy, sank 14 Allied vessels in the first 2 years of the war, and earned the personal commendation of Admiral Yamamoto himself. His submarine was one of Japan's newest, equipped with the latest torpedo technology, and manned by a crew that had been hunting American ships since Pearl Harbor. But something was different about this particular destroyer escort. Tanaka had been tracking American naval movements for months, and he'd noticed a disturbing pattern. Ships that should have been easy targets were somehow evading his attacks. Convoys that should have been sitting ducks were arriving at their destinations intact. And destroyer escorts, supposedly the weakest link in the American naval chain, were sinking Japanese submarines at an alarming rate. The I-47 had been stalking Whitmore since dawn, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Tanaka's torpedo rooms were loaded with Type 95 torpedoes, each one capable of breaking a destroyer escort in half with a single hit. All he needed was the right angle, the right distance, and the element of surprise. On the surface, Morrison's sonar operator, Petty Officer 2nd Class Danny Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas, hunched over his equipment with the intensity of a man's life depended on every sound wave bouncing back from the ocean floor. Rodriguez had been tracking something for the past hour, not a definite contact, but a pattern in the background noise that didn't belong. It was subtle, almost impossible to detect, but Rodriguez had been listening to the ocean's voice for 2 years, and he knew when something was out of place. "Sir," Rodriguez called out, his voice steady despite the tension. "I'm getting intermittent contacts, bearing 270, range approximately 4,000 yards. Morrison moved to the sonar station with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his entire adult life on rolling decks. He slipped on the headphones and listened to the underwater symphony that Rodriguez had been monitoring. For 30 seconds, he heard nothing but the usual cacophony of ocean sounds, waves, thermal layers, distant whale songs, and the ever-present hum of his own ship's machinery. Then he heard it. A metallic whisper, barely audible above the background noise. The distinctive sound of steel hull plates expanding and contracting under pressure. A submarine, running deep and quiet, trying to remain invisible. "General quarters," Morrison ordered, his voice carrying across the bridge with calm authority. "Sound battle stations, all hands to submarine attack positions." The Whitmore transformed in seconds. Sailors raced to their stations with practiced efficiency, the ship's defensive systems coming online as damage control teams sealed watertight doors and prepared for combat. The Destroyer Escorts' twin 3-inch guns swiveled toward the suspected submarine position, while depth charge crews began preparing their deadly cargo. Beneath the waves, Tanaka heard the subtle changes in the destroyer engine rhythm that indicated the ship had gone to battle stations. His hydrophone operator, Senior Petty Officer Kenji Yamada, looked up from his instruments with wide eyes. "Commander, they know we're here," Yamada whispered. Tanaka nodded grimly. Somehow, despite running silent at maximum depth, the Americans had detected his presence. It should have been impossible. The I-47 was one of the quietest submarines in the Imperial Navy, and Tanaka's crew had perfected the art of underwater stealth through months of rigorous training. "Prepare tubes 1 through 4, Tanaka ordered. "Set depth for 12 feet. We'll make this quick and decisive." The submarine's torpedo room came alive with activity as the crew loaded and armed 4 Type 95 torpedoes. Each weapon weighed over 2 tons and carried a warhead capable of sinking any destroyer escort ever built. Tanaka moved to the periscope and raised it just enough to get a clear view of his target. The Whitmore had changed course and was now zigzagging in an evasive pattern that would make a torpedo solution nearly impossible to calculate. But Tanaka was one of the Imperial Navy's most experienced submarine commanders, and he'd sunk American ships under far more difficult circumstances. What he didn't know was that Lieutenant Commander Morrison had spent the past 6 months studying captured Japanese torpedo fragments, analyzing attack patterns, and developing new tactical procedures specifically designed to counter submarine threats. The seemingly random zigzag pattern wasn't random at all. It was a carefully calculated dance designed to force enemy submarines into making predictable moves. On the surface, Morrison studied his plotting board with the focused intensity of a chess master contemplating his next move. His executive officer, Lieutenant James Parker from Portland, Maine, stood beside him watching the tactical situation develop. "Contact is maintaining position," Rodriguez reported from the sonar station. "Bearing steady at 270, range now 3,800 yards. Morrison nodded. The submarine commander was good, very good. Instead of fleeing or attacking immediately, he was holding position, probably trying to work out a firing solution. But that patience was about to be his greatest weakness. "Come left to course 090, increase speed to 22 knots, prepare depth charge pattern Baker."
Whitmore heeled over as she came to her new course, her wake foaming white behind her as the twin screws bit deeper into the ocean. To any observer, it would appear that the Destroyer Escort was simply continuing her patrol pattern. But Morrison was executing a maneuver he'd perfected over months of training, drawing the submarine into a position where it would have to choose between attacking or retreating, and either choice would expose its exact location. Tanaka watched through his periscope as the American ship changed course and increased speed. The maneuver was putting the Destroyer Escort into a perfect attack position, presenting her starboard side at an angle that would allow his torpedoes to strike the most vulnerable part of the hull. It was almost too good to be true. "Flood tubes 1 through 4, he ordered. "Solution set. Range 3,500 yards, bearing 095 degrees. The I-47 shuddered slightly as seawater flooded into the torpedo tubes, preparing the weapons for launch. Tanaka made one final calculation, adjusting for the target's speed and heading. In 60 seconds, 4 Type 95 torpedoes would be racing through the water toward the American Destroyer Escort. But Morrison had been counting on exactly this response. His seemingly vulnerable course change was actually positioning Whitmore for a devastating counterattack. As the submarine prepared to fire, Morrison was preparing to spring his trap. "Sonar contact firming up," Rodriguez announced. "Definite submarine bearing 268 degrees, range 3,400 yards. She's flooded down, sir, preparing to attack." Morrison smiled grimly. After 6 days of hunting, he finally had his quarry exactly where he wanted it. The Japanese submarine commander was about to learn why American destroyer escorts had become the most feared anti-submarine weapons in the Pacific Fleet. "Fire 1." Tanaka's voice cut through the cramped silence of the I-47's torpedo room as the first Type 95 torpedo erupted from its tube with a hydraulic hiss. The submarine lurched slightly as 2 tons of death accelerated away from her hull, its wake homing system immediately locking on to the destroyer escort's churning propellers. "Fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. Within 18 seconds, 4 torpedoes were racing through the dark water toward the USS Whitmore, their electric motors driving them at 46 knots in a spread pattern designed to compensate for any last-second evasive maneuvers. Tanaka had calculated the intercept perfectly, or so he thought. On the surface, Seaman First Class Bobby Mitchell from rural Kentucky was manning the starboard lookout when he spotted something that made his blood freeze. 4 parallel wakes, arrow straight and moving fast, cutting through the water directly toward his ship. "Torpedoes in the water!" Mitchell's voice cracked as he screamed the warning that every sailor dreaded. "4 fish, starboard beam, closing fast!" Morrison had been expecting this moment, but the sight of those deadly wakes still sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. This was the critical test of everything he'd learned about submarine warfare. The next 60 seconds would determine whether his theories about Japanese torpedo tactics were correct, or whether Whitmore and her entire crew would join the hundreds of Allied ships already resting on the Pacific floor. "Emergency turn to port," Morrison barked. "All ahead flank. Launch countermeasures." The destroyer escort heeled over so violently that several sailors grabbed stanchions to keep from being thrown across the deck. Chief Petty Officer William Hayes from Chicago, the ship's senior damage control specialist, was already sealing watertight compartments and preparing his teams for the worst. Hayes had survived the sinking of 2 previous ships and knew that the difference between life and death often came down to seconds and inches. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But Morrison wasn't just trying to dodge the torpedoes, he was executing a maneuver that would position his ship for an immediate counterattack. As the Whitmore's stern swung around, it brought her sonar into perfect alignment with the submarine's position. The Japanese commander had revealed his exact location by firing, and now Morrison intended to make him pay for that mistake. "Depth charge crews, stand by!" Lieutenant Parker shouted over the howling wind and spray. "Pattern Charlie, set for 250 and 300 feet." The first torpedo missed the Whitmore's stern by less than 30 yards, its wake clearly visible as it raced past into empty ocean. The second torpedo passed harmlessly beneath the ship's keel as her emergency turn lifted her hull higher in the water. But the third and fourth torpedoes were tracking true, their primitive guidance systems locked onto the Destroyer Escort's propeller noise.
Morrison watched the approaching wakes with the cold calculation of a man who'd faced death dozens of times. At the last possible second, he gave the order that separated experienced commanders from dead heroes. "Emergency stop! All back full!" The Whitmore's twin screws bit into the water in reverse, creating a massive wall of churning foam that confused the torpedo's acoustic guidance systems. The third torpedo, suddenly deprived of its target signature, began circling in confusion before its fuel ran out and it sank harmlessly into the depths. The fourth torpedo shot past the now stationary Destroyer Escort and disappeared into the distance. 300 feet below, Tanaka stared at his periscope in disbelief. 4 perfect torpedo shots, and the American ship had somehow evaded all of them. It shouldn't have been possible. No Destroyer Escort commander should have possessed the skill and knowledge necessary to execute such a complex, evasive maneuver. "Dive to 400 feet, he ordered, his voice betraying none of the shock he felt. "Emergency speed, rig for depth charges." But Morrison was already one step ahead. As soon as the last torpedo wake had disappeared, he'd ordered his ship back to flank speed and positioned her directly over the submarine's estimated location. The depth charge crews were ready, their weapons set for precise detonation depths based on Morrison's analysis of Japanese submarine construction. "Now!" Morrison shouted. The first pattern of depth charges rolled off the Whitmore's stern like deadly eggs, their hydrostatic fuses set to detonate at carefully calculated depths. Each charge contained 300 pounds of TNT, enough to crack a submarine's pressure hull if detonated within 50 feet. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Sullivan from Boston, the ship's weapons specialist, had personally supervised the loading of each depth charge. Sullivan was one of the few women serving aboard combat vessels, having earned her position through exceptional expertise in underwater ordnance. She'd studied Japanese submarine specifications captured from previous engagements and knew exactly how to position the charges for maximum effect. The ocean erupted in a series of massive explosions that sent geysers of water hundreds of feet into the air. The concussions hammered against the I-47's hull like the fists of an angry god, causing lights to flicker and gauges to dance wildly. In the submarine's engineering section, Petty Officer Ichiro Sato watched in horror as several hull plates began weeping seawater under the tremendous pressure. "Hull breach in compartment 4, Sato shouted over the chaos. "Minor flooding, but the plates are stressed beyond safe limits." Tanaka felt his submarine shudder under the impact of the depth charges, but the I-47 was built to withstand punishment. Japanese submarine construction emphasized durability over speed, and her thick steel hull had been designed to survive exactly this type of attack. However, the precision of the American depth charge pattern was unlike anything he'd experienced before. Most Allied ships dropped their depth charges in random patterns, hoping to get lucky. But this Destroyer Escort was placing her weapons with surgical precision, each explosion calculated to maximize damage to critical submarine systems. It was as if the American commander knew exactly how Japanese submarines were built and where they were most vulnerable. "Silent running," Tanaka whispered. "All stop. Secure all unnecessary equipment." The I-47 became a steel tomb, her crew frozen at their stations as they waited for the next attack. In the torpedo room, Chief Petty Officer Takeshi Nakamura quietly began reloading the empty tubes, knowing that their survival might depend on getting off another salvo. But the submarine's compressed air system had been damaged by the depth charge attack, making torpedo firing extremely difficult. On the surface, Morrison studied his sonar readings with intense concentration. The submarine had gone completely silent, but Rodriguez was tracking tiny anomalies in the water temperature and pressure that indicated a large metal object moving slowly beneath them. "She's damaged," Morrison announced to his bridge crew. "I can hear water pumps running. She's taking on flooding but trying to stay quiet about it." Lieutenant Parker checked the ship's ammunition stores. "Sir, we have 18 depth charges remaining, plus the forward hedgehog mortars." Morrison nodded. The hedgehog system was newer technology, 24 small projectiles fired in a circular pattern ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, hedgehogs only explode on direct contact with a submarine's hull, making them devastatingly effective if properly aimed. "Come left to course 270, Morrison ordered. "Prepare a hedgehog pattern, we're going to finish this." Deep beneath the waves, Tanaka made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The I-47 was damaged but still capable of fighting. His crew was experienced and disciplined. His remaining torpedoes could still sink the American Destroyer Escort if he could get into position for another attack. But as he listened to the precise, methodical sounds of the enemy ship maneuvering above him, Tanaka began to realize something that would fundamentally change his understanding of American naval capabilities. This wasn't just another destroyer escort with a lucky commander. This was something entirely different. A weapon system specifically designed and trained to hunt and kill Japanese submarines with ruthless efficiency. The Americans had turned submarine warfare into a science. 400 feet below, the I-47 drifted like a wounded whale, her hull creaking under the immense pressure as Tanaka's crew worked frantically to repair the damage from Morrison's depth charge attack. In the submarine's cramped engineering compartment, Petty Officer Sato and his team were fighting a losing battle against steadily rising water levels. "Bilge pumps are barely keeping pace," Sato reported through gritted teeth. "If we take another hit like that, we'll be forced to surface." Tanaka absorbed this information with the stoic calm that had made him one of Japan's most respected submarine commanders. But beneath his composed exterior, a profound shift was taking place. For the first time in his career, he was beginning to understand that the war in the Pacific had fundamentally changed. The Americans had turned submarine warfare into a science. 400 feet below the Philippine Sea, the I-47 drifted like a wounded whale, her hull creaking under the immense pressure as Tanaka's crew worked frantically to repair the damage from Morrison's depth charge attack. In the submarine's cramped engineering compartment, Petty Officer Sato and his team were fighting a losing battle against steadily rising water levels. "Bilge pumps are barely keeping pace," Sato reported through gritted teeth. "If we take another hit like that, we'll be forced to surface." Tanaka absorbed this information with the stoic calm that had made him one of Japan's most respected submarine commanders. But beneath his composed exterior, a profound shift was taking place. For the first time in his career, he was beginning to understand that the war in the Pacific had fundamentally changed. The Americans had turned submarine warfare into a science. Above them, Morrison was orchestrating what could only be described as a symphony of destruction. Every member of his crew had been trained for this exact scenario, their movements precise and coordinated like the components of a finely tuned machine. Gunner's Mate First Class Robert Chen from San Francisco was preparing the hedgehog mortars with mechanical precision, each projectile carefully inspected and loaded according to specifications Morrison had personally developed. "Hedgehog ready for firing, sir," Chen reported. 24 rounds loaded, contact fuses armed." Morrison studied the tactical plot that Ensign Thomas Anderson from Minneapolis had been meticulously updating. Anderson was fresh out of the Naval Academy, but he possessed an analytical mind that Morrison had quickly learned to trust. The young officer's calculations showed the submarine's probable position based on current drift, damage assessment, and likely evasive maneuvers. "They're hurt, but they're not finished," Anderson observed. "Based on the flooding sounds Rodriguez is picking up, I estimate they've lost about 15% of their battery power to pumping operations." This was the new face of naval warfare, scientific, calculated, and utterly ruthless. Morrison had spent months studying every aspect of Japanese submarine operations, from their construction techniques to their tactical doctrines.
He knew that Commander Tanaka was probably one of Japan's elite submarine officers, a man trained in the traditional aggressive tactics that had made the Imperial Navy feared across the Pacific. But those tactics were based on fighting an enemy that relied on luck, intuition, and overwhelming firepower. What Tanaka was facing now was something entirely different. A systematic approach to submarine hunting that treated each engagement as a problem to be solved through careful analysis and precise execution. "Take us to the attack position," Morrison ordered, "ahead 1/3. I want to be directly over his position when we fire." The Whitmore glided forward with predatory grace, her sonar equipment painting a detailed picture of the ocean floor below. Fire Control Technician Second Class Patricia Walsh from Detroit monitored the Hedgehog firing solution, her instruments tracking minute changes in the submarine's position. Walsh had originally trained as a mathematics before the war, and her ability to calculate complex three-dimensional problems had made her indispensable to Morrison's anti-submarine operations. "Target bearing constant," Walsh announced, "range decreasing, solution holding steady." Deep in the I-47's torpedo room, Chief Petty Officer Nakamura was struggling with damaged equipment that refused to cooperate. The submarine's compressed air system had been compromised by the depth charge attack, making it nearly impossible to fire their remaining torpedoes. Even if they could get the weapons out of the tubes, the firing signature would immediately reveal their exact position to the destroyer escort circling overhead. "Sir," Nakamura reported to Tanaka over the intercom, "torpedo tubes are operational, but we'll only get one salvo. After that, we'll be defenseless." Tanaka weighed his options with the careful deliberation of a chess master contemplating his final moves. He could attempt another torpedo attack, but the probability of success was minimal given the American commander's demonstrated skill at evasive maneuvering. He could try to escape by running deep and silent, but the flooding damage would eventually force him to surface where the destroyer's guns would finish them. Or he could do something that went against every principle of submarine warfare he'd been taught: surrender the initiative and wait for his opponent to make the next move. On the surface, Morrison was making that move with deadly precision. The Hedgehog system represented a revolutionary advance in anti-submarine warfare, and Morrison had been one of the first commanders to master its tactical applications. Unlike depth charges, which relied on proximity explosions, Hedgehogs only detonated on direct contact with their target. This meant that every explosion indicated a hit, and every hit was potentially fatal. "Fire Hedgehogs," Morrison commanded. 24 projectiles arced through the air in a perfect circular pattern, each one following a ballistic trajectory calculated to place it within the submarine's probable location. The weapons hit the water with barely a splash, then sank rapidly toward their target. Walsh tracked each projectile on her instruments, her calculations showing the precise moment of impact. The first Hedgehog struck the I-47's forward hull plates with a thunderous explosion that sent shockwaves through every compartment. The second and third projectiles followed milliseconds later. Their contact fuses triggered massive blasts that buckled steel plating and shattered internal bulkheads. In the submarine's control room, chaos erupted as lights failed and instrument panels sparked. Tanaka was thrown against the periscope housing as his ship convulsed under the multiple impacts. The sound was undescribable, like being inside a giant bell while it was struck with sledgehammers. "Forward compartments flooding," came the panicked shout from damage control. "We're taking water faster than the pumps can handle." But the Hedgehog attack had done something else that Morrison hadn't anticipated. It had given him a perfect acoustic signature of the submarine's internal structure. Rodriguez was listening to the sounds of buckling metal, rushing water, and emergency equipment activation with the trained ear of a master craftsman analyzing his work. "Sir, she's breaking up internally," Rodriguez reported with clinical detachment. "I can hear bulkheads collapsing and major flooding in at least 3 compartments." Morrison nodded grimly. The I-47 was finished as a fighting vessel, but the question remained whether her crew would choose to fight to the death or accept the inevitable. In his months of studying Japanese naval culture, Morrison had learned that surrender was considered the ultimate dishonor for Imperial Navy officers. Deep beneath the waves, Tanaka was coming to the same conclusion. His submarine was dying around him, her hull plates groaning under pressures they were never designed to withstand. In the engine room, seawater was rising toward critical electrical systems that would cause catastrophic explosions if they shorted out. His crew, the finest submariners in the Imperial Navy, were looking to him for orders that he was no longer qualified to give. For the first time in his career, Commander Hiroshi Tanaka was forced to acknowledge a truth that would shatter everything he believed about Japanese naval supremacy. The Americans hadn't just gotten lucky, they had systematically outfought, outmaneuvered, and outfought one of Japan's most experienced submarine crews using tactics and technology that rendered traditional submarine warfare obsolete.
The hunter had become the hunted, and the predator had become prey. But more than that, Tanaka was beginning to realize that this engagement represented something far more significant than a single tactical victory. This was evidence of a fundamental shift in naval warfare that would change the balance of power in the Pacific forever. As emergency alarms wailed throughout the I-47 and his crew prepared for what might be their final battle, Tanaka made a decision that would echo through the corridors of Imperial Navy headquarters for months to come. Commander Tanaka's decision came not from desperation, but from a cold calculation that would have impressed even his American adversary. With water rising past the submarine's critical systems and his crew's lives hanging by a thread, he chose the one option that traditional Japanese naval doctrine had never prepared him for: tactical withdrawal with the intention of survival and intelligence gathering. "Emergency blow all ballast tanks," Tanaka ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos of alarms and shouting crewmen. "Prepare for an emergency surface. All hands brace for rapid ascent." The I-47 shot toward the surface like a cork from a champagne bottle, her ballast tanks expelling thousands of gallons of seawater in a desperate bid to reach the safety of open air before her flooding compartments could drag her to the ocean floor. In the submarine's cramped quarters, Petty Officer Yamada was documenting everything he observed about the American attack patterns, his training as an intelligence specialist overriding his natural fear. On the surface, sonar operator Rodriguez detected the massive acoustic signature of a submarine blowing ballast. "Contact, surfacing rapidly," he announced. "Bearing 275 degrees, range 800 yards. Morrison had anticipated this possibility. A damaged submarine commander faced with certain death would either choose to go down fighting or attempt to surface and engage with deck guns. Either way, the tactical situation was about to change dramatically. "All hands to surface action stations," Morrison commanded. "Gun crews, prepare for surface engagement. Stand by to take prisoners." The transformation of the USS Whitmore from submarine hunter to surface combatant took less than 90 seconds. Quartermaster First Class David Murphy from Phoenix, Arizona, swung the ship's twin 3-inch guns toward the surfacing submarine, while Boatswain's Mate Chief Samuel Washington from New Orleans prepared boarding parties and medical teams. Washington had served in the Merchant Marine before the war and understood that naval combat often ended with the grim business of rescuing enemy survivors. The I-47 broke the surface in a fountain of spray and foam, her dark hull gleaming wet in the afternoon sunlight. Tanaka was the first man through the conning tower hatch, his trained eyes immediately assessing the tactical situation. The American Destroyer Escort was positioned perfectly for a gunnery engagement, her weapons already trained on his submarine.
But instead of immediately opening fire, the American commander was following protocols that Tanaka had never encountered before. A signal lamp began flashing from the Destroyer Escorts bridge, international maritime code requesting surrender and offering safe passage for survivors. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was demonstrating something that Japanese naval training had taught was impossible. An American officer following the established rules of maritime warfare even when holding overwhelming tactical advantage. This wasn't the behavior of the bloodthirsty barbarians that Imperial Navy propaganda had described. "Signal them back," Tanaka ordered his communications officer, Senior Petty Officer Koji Watanabe. "We acknowledge their terms." The decision to surrender went against every instinct of Tanaka's training, but his responsibility to his crew superseded his personal honor. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that this engagement represented intelligence of incalculable value to the Imperial Navy. The American tactics he'd witnessed were so far advanced beyond anything in Japanese naval doctrine that they represented either a revolutionary breakthrough or evidence of systematic technological superiority. As the I-47's crew began emerging from their damaged submarine, Morrison ordered his medical officer, Lieutenant Sarah Coleman from Denver, Colorado, to prepare for casualties. Coleman had volunteered for naval service despite the restrictions on women in combat roles, earning her position through exceptional medical expertise and an unshakable determination to serve her country. "Boarding party, stand by," Morrison announced. "Standard prisoner protocols. Treat all enemy personnel with dignity and provide immediate medical assistance as required." The rescue operation that followed would later be studied at naval academies as a textbook example of professional seamanship under combat conditions. Morrison's crew executed prisoner recovery procedures with mechanical precision, separating officers from enlisted personnel for interrogation, while providing immediate medical care to the injured. Chief Hospital Corpsman Michael Torres from Albuquerque, New Mexico, was among the first Americans to board the damaged submarine. Torres had trained extensively in emergency medicine and spoke fluent Japanese, a skill that proved invaluable as he tended to wounded enemy sailors while gathering intelligence about their vessel's capabilities. "This isn't a standard I-class submarine," Torres reported to Morrison over the radio. "The torpedo room configuration is completely different from our intelligence estimates. They've got equipment I've never seen before." As Tanaka was escorted aboard the Whitmore, he found himself face to face with the man who had systematically dismantled his submarine and crew with tactical precision that bordered on the supernatural. Morrison was younger than expected, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a bearing that suggested absolute confidence in his abilities. "Commander Tanaka," Morrison said in carefully pronounced Japanese, "I regret the circumstances of our meeting, but I want you to know that your submarine was handled with exceptional skill. My crew and I have great respect for your seamanship." The courtesy was unexpected and deeply unsettling. Tanaka had been prepared for interrogation, imprisonment, or even execution. He had not been prepared for professional recognition from an enemy who had just destroyed his command with surgical precision. "Your tactics," Tanaka replied in heavily accented English, "they are not what we were taught to expect from American naval forces." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "The war has changed, Commander. Both sides have had to adapt. Your submarine force taught us lessons we couldn't afford to ignore."
During the next 6 hours, as the Whitmore's crew worked to salvage what they could from the I-47 before she finally slipped beneath the waves, an extraordinary exchange took place between Morrison and Tanaka. Under the established rules of maritime warfare, prisoners were required to provide only their name, rank, and serial number. But Tanaka found himself engaging in detailed discussions about naval tactics, submarine design, and the evolution of Pacific naval warfare. What emerged from these conversations would later be documented in intelligence reports that reached the highest levels of both naval commands. Morrison learned that Japanese submarine doctrine was based on outdated assumptions about American anti-submarine capabilities. Tanaka learned that American destroyer escorts had been systematically redesigned and retrained specifically to counter Japanese submarine threats. "Your depth charge patterns," Tanaka observed as they watched his submarine's final moments, "were calculated based on our hull specifications. You know exactly how our submarines are built." Morrison confirmed what Tanaka had already suspected. "We've been studying every piece of wreckage, every captured document, every survivor interview for 2 years. We've built a complete technical profile of Imperial Navy submarine operations." As the sun set over the Philippine Sea and the I-47 disappeared beneath the waves forever, both commanders understood that they had participated in something far more significant than a single tactical engagement. They had witnessed the collision of two completely different approaches to naval warfare, one based on tradition, honor, and individual heroism, the other based on systematic analysis, technological innovation, and coordinated teamwork. The implications would reshape the Pacific War. 3 days after the sinking of the I-47, Commander Hiroshi Tanaka sat in the prisoner of war facility on Saipan, staring at a blank sheet of paper that would soon contain the most important intelligence report in the history of Japanese submarine warfare. The American interrogation officers had been professional but thorough, and Tanaka had come to understand that his capture represented far more than a single tactical defeat. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, no relation to the destroyer escort commander, was the senior intelligence officer conducting Tanaka's debriefing. Morrison had studied at the Naval War College before the conflict and spoke fluent Japanese, having served as a military attaché in Tokyo during the late 1930s. His understanding of Japanese military culture made him uniquely qualified to extract meaningful intelligence from captured officers. "Commander Tanaka," Morrison began during their final interview session, "you've been remarkably forthcoming about your tactical observations. But I need you to understand something that might not be immediately apparent. What you experienced wasn't an isolated incident. It's become the standard operating procedure for our destroyer escort fleet." The implications of this statement hit Tanaka like a physical blow. If the systematic anti-submarine tactics he'd encountered were being deployed across the entire American fleet, then every Japanese submarine in the Pacific was operating under a fundamental misconception about enemy capabilities. "How many destroyer escorts have been modified with these new procedures?" Tanaka asked, his professional curiosity overriding his natural reluctance to provide intelligence assistance to his captors. Morrison consulted a document that had been declassified specifically for this interrogation. "As of last month, we have 137 destroyer escorts operating in the Pacific Theater. All of them have been equipped and trained according to the protocols you encountered." The mathematics were staggering. Japanese submarine doctrine assumed that destroyer escorts were the weakest component of American naval defenses, suitable targets for aggressive attack rather than threats to be avoided. If American intelligence was accurate, then the Imperial Navy had been feeding its most valuable submarines into a systematic slaughter for months. Back aboard the USS Whitmore, Lieutenant Commander Frank Morrison was completing his own intelligence assessment of the engagement. His after-action report would eventually be distributed to every destroyer escort commander in the Pacific Fleet, but its immediate impact would be felt at the highest levels of naval command. Executive Officer James Parker was helping Morrison compile technical specifications of the I-47 that had been gathered during the brief boarding operation. The submarine's torpedo room configuration, sonar equipment, and battery systems all represented significant advances over previous Japanese submarine designs. "They're not standing still," Parker observed as he reviewed the technical drawings that Torres had sketched during his medical inspection of the submarine. "This boat was carrying experimental equipment we haven't seen before." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. The I-47 had been equipped with what appeared to be an early form of snorkel system, allowing the submarine to run its diesel engines while remaining submerged. "Get this information to Naval Intelligence immediately. Priority transmission. They need to know that Japanese submarine capabilities are evolving faster than our intelligence estimates." Meanwhile, in the cramped radio room of a Japanese destroyer operating 200 miles northwest of the engagement area, Senior Radio Officer Hiroshi Yamamoto was receiving a coded transmission that would send shockwaves through the Imperial Navy's submarine command. The message was brief but devastating. I-47 lost with all hands. Destroyer escort capabilities exceed all previous estimates. Recommend immediate tactical reassessment. The transmission had been sent by another Japanese submarine that had been monitoring radio traffic during the engagement. Commander Isamu Fujita of the I-58 had been close enough to observe the surface action between the Whitmore and the I-47, and what he'd witnessed had fundamentally altered his understanding of American anti-submarine warfare. Fujita's own report, transmitted to fleet headquarters through encrypted channels, provided a second perspective on the engagement that corroborated everything Tanaka would later document in his prisoner interviews. The Americans weren't just getting lucky, they had systematically revolutionized their approach to submarine hunting with scientific precision that made traditional Japanese tactics obsolete. At Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Koshiro Oikawa was reviewing intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of Japanese submarine effectiveness in the Pacific. Over the past 6 months, submarine losses had increased by 300%, while successful attacks on American shipping had declined by 60%. The correlation with increased American destroyer escort deployments was unmistakable. "Bring me everything we have on American anti-submarine procedures," Oikawa ordered his intelligence staff. "I want technical specifications, tactical analyses, and personnel profiles. If the Americans have developed new methods for hunting our submarines, we need to understand them immediately."
The research that followed would reveal the extent of American systematization in naval warfare. Starting in late 1942, the United States Navy had begun treating submarine hunting as an engineering problem rather than a tactical challenge. Every engagement was analyzed, every successful technique was codified, and every destroyer escort crew was trained to identical standards of precision and effectiveness. Commander Tanaka's final intelligence report, completed after 2 weeks of intensive debriefing, would become one of the most important documents in the history of Pacific naval warfare. Written in the formal style required by Imperial Navy regulations, it documented not just the tactical details of his engagement with the Whitmore, but the broader strategic implications of American naval evolution. The enemy destroyer escort, USS Whitmore, demonstrated tactical capabilities that exceed all previous intelligence estimates, Tanaka wrote in his carefully composed analysis. Their anti-submarine procedures appear to be based on comprehensive technical knowledge of Imperial Navy submarine specifications, suggesting systematic intelligence gathering and analysis over an extended period. The report continued with detailed descriptions of American sonar capabilities, depth charge placement techniques, and coordination between surface vessels and aircraft. But the most significant section dealt with what Tanaka termed the systematization of naval warfare. The American approach of treating each engagement as a scientific problem with quantifiable solutions. Traditional concepts of naval honor and individual heroism, Tanaka concluded, have been superseded by coordinated team tactics and technological superiority. The American naval force we encountered operated with the precision of a machine designed specifically for submarine destruction. When Admiral Oikawa finished reading Tanaka's report, he immediately convened an emergency meeting of the Imperial Navy's senior submarine commanders. The document represented the first comprehensive analysis of American anti-submarine evolution, and its implications were catastrophic for Japanese naval strategy. "We have been sending our submarines against an enemy that knows more about our capabilities than we know about theirs," Oikawa announced to the assembled officers. Commander Tanaka's analysis suggests that American destroyer escorts have been specifically designed and trained to counter our submarine tactics. The meeting that followed would result in a complete restructuring of Japanese submarine operations. New tactics were developed emphasizing stealth over aggression, deep water operations over coastal attacks, and survival over heroic sacrifice. But these changes came too late to alter the fundamental trajectory of the Pacific War. Back on Saipan, Commander Tanaka was completing his final interview with American intelligence officers when he was asked a question that would haunt him for decades to come. "Commander," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison asked, "in your professional opinion, how many other Japanese submarine commanders understand what you've learned about American capabilities?" Tanaka considered the question carefully before responding. "Based on survival rates and intelligence reports, I estimate that fewer than 20 Japanese submarine commanders have encountered American destroyer escorts using these new tactics and lived to report their observations." The mathematics were sobering. The Imperial Navy had deployed over 200 submarines in the Pacific Theater since Pearl Harbor. If Tanaka's estimate was accurate, then more than 90% of Japanese submarine commanders were operating under tactical assumptions that would get them killed. The final section of Tanaka's intelligence report contained a recommendation that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Imperial Navy submarine operations should be suspended until effective countermeasures can be developed against American anti-submarine technology and tactics. When this recommendation reached Emperor Hirohito himself, it contributed to discussions about negotiating an end to the Pacific conflict. The systematic destruction of Japan's submarine fleet represented more than tactical defeats. It demonstrated American industrial and technological superiority that made ultimate Japanese victory impossible. Commander Tanaka's letter, originally intended as a routine intelligence report, had become evidence of a fundamental shift in global naval power. The age of individual heroism and traditional tactics had ended, replaced by systematic warfare conducted with scientific precision and overwhelming material superiority. The destroyer escorts that Japanese submariners had dismissed as easy targets had proven to be the most effective anti-submarine weapons ever deployed in naval warfare. Commander Tanaka's admission of their tactical superiority represented not just the end of the Imperial Navy submarine threat, but the beginning of Japan's recognition that the Pacific War could not be won. In the decades that followed, military historians would study the engagement between the USS Whitmore and the I-47 as a perfect example of how technological innovation and systematic training could overcome traditional military advantages. But for the families of the submarine crews who never returned home, Tanaka's letter represented something far more personal. Acknowledgement that their sons and fathers had faced an enemy against whom courage and skill were no longer sufficient for survival. The Pacific War would continue for another 16 months, but the systematic destruction of Japan's submarine fleet had already determined its ultimate outcome. Commander Tanaka's letter had documented not just a tactical defeat, but the end of an era in naval warfare itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.